Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. Now you can even hear me. So, all right, so I'm going to talk about leadership in sort of a bigger picture manner. So there's a lot of, actually a lot of literature on lean leadership or particular kinds of leadership styles, and they all claim to be the style, the ideal. And reality is a little bit more complicated than that, so that's essentially what I'm going to talk about today. Now, how many of you are in organizations that feel a bit like this? So this is not Sweden, so you're not all introverts, so you can raise your hand. Okay, I'm from Norway, so I'm obligated to make fun of the Swedes, and vice versa. Now, I would say more than half of the organizations that we've done lean transformations with kind of feel like that. And then the rest of them feel a bit like this. So they're suffering because they don't have work systems that are well designed enough, so people spend more time juggling the ball than moving the ball. Yeah. So, and when you have either this problem or that problem, you need to start looking at how your work is designed. So why are we all here? I would posit that the reason we're all here is we're pursuing a certain kind of ideal. We'd like to be able to build what I would call beautiful organizations. What's a beautiful organization? Well, it's one where we have clarity, visibility, transparency. It's one where we don't have to be afraid to try out new things and be creative, and even go nuts, and where that feels okay. Where we can collaborate and do some really great work together, cross whatever boundaries that other people in non-beautiful organizations would be hampered by. And where we can design amazing products, that truly have an impact, where we can have employees and managers grow as people. So it's not just about delivering shareholder value, it's about delivering an amazing employee experience as well for everyone. And hopefully, we can do this so well that we leave our competitors far behind. Now, lots of different moving parts to all of this, right? That's a really complicated thing. So we've been at this for a decade, doing lean transformations for knowledge-intensive organizations. And, we too developed our methodology, our framework, and so on. You can read about that elsewhere. But what we found was that you can have all the methodology in the world, and if you don't tackle leadership, or rather, if you're a consultant, if you don't help your clients tackle leadership, not just on the middle management level, I thought the previous story was truly heroic, but also at the highest levels, you're not really fundamentally going to get there. You're not going to get a beautiful organization. You're going to get a better organization, but you're not going to reach that ultimate ideal. So let's talk about leadership. It's good to start with a definition when you're going to talk about a topic. And the one we use is by Edwin Locke, who is a very well-known author in the leadership field. He's very famous for his theory on goal setting and motivation. And I'm very proud to say he's on our advisory board, so I'm a bit biased. But I think he's the most frequently cited author on goal setting and motivation in leadership. And Ed's definition is that leadership is the process of inducing others to pursue a common goal or vision. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? So let's break that down a little bit. So it's a process. Means it's never done. It's ongoing. Leadership is not something you check off, right? You can't say, I've done leadership today. It never stops. Then you have to figure out how to persuade others. Unless you are in the military, and even if you are in the military, you can't really order people effectively to do stuff. You have to make a good case. You have to get them excited. You have to persuade them. And there has to be a shared destination. And that destination, that goal or vision, has to be compelling enough and realistic enough that it's possible and worthwhile pursuing. Of course, this is more the reality. This is what we all face, whether we're coaches trying to help organizations or whether we work in them. More often than not, you go into a room and you're trying to embark on some new bold thing. As a leader, this is the reality you have to deal with. It may not even be your fault. There may be other stuff going on. That's nothing to do with your performance. So here's some common challenges that we see with leaders. One is that your vision is just crappy. It's boring. I mean, why? I mean, why do you get up? We work so much more. Half our lives we spend working, right? Well, some of us more. It better be worth it, getting up in the morning. But I see so much this lack of ambition and imagination. I would say that's the number one issue in leadership, is we're not even trying. We're just doing the safe thing. We're doing something that's a little bit better than yesterday. You're not going to get a beautiful organization that way. You're going to get a better organization. You're going to get paid. But, it might be more interesting just to do something else. Now, maybe you have a great vision, but you don't know how to tell the story. So you have this amazing idea in your head. You're the CEO or you're a team lead, whatever level in the organization, and you just can't either put two words together or come up with inspiring visuals. When you talk to people, their eyes glaze over. That's a storytelling problem. So it's important to know whether you have the first or the second. Maybe you don't have the right people in the organization for where you're trying to go. We see that quite frequently. That's a tough one. In cases where you're making a dramatic change in terms of the culture, the business model, direction, markets, not everyone who's in the organization can necessarily follow you or follow you fast enough to where you need to go. You can do a better job as a leader to make it easier for people and make it more attractive for them to follow you there, but some people will choose to part ways, and some people should be encouraged to part ways, and that's perfectly okay. Now, if you don't do a good job as a leader, your leadership capital or your credibility will erode, and that makes it harder for people to sort of take a chance on whatever goals or a crazy adventure that you propose embarking on. So that's one way of looking at leadership effectiveness, and I'll get back to that in a few moments. And of course, if you don't do a good job as a leader, your level of employee engagement, their enthusiasm for their work and their ability to contribute to the organization, that will go down. And that's actually a big international problem. So here's some statistics from last year. There's a blog post I wrote called about lean and leadership engagement, or rather employee engagement, sorry. And essentially more than half of employees on a good day are feeling disengaged in their jobs. And when you start breaking that down in terms of managers versus entry-level employees, you'll find that people have less patience if they haven't been in the organization that long. And this directly correlates with how likely they are to stay with your organization. So you need to take that seriously. Now, if you are an executive, this is really stressful, right? You're trying to move the organization. Let's say you're the CEO. We generally work on the board CEO level, so we talk to those guys a lot, and they're frustrated. I can't get the organization to get from A to B. I can't tell my story, or sometimes we have to tell them, it's not your story, I'm sorry, you're just not really getting people excited because what you're proposing just isn't that exciting. Go rethink it. If you are an individual contributor, and there's an employee engagement problem, your job is just going to suck. And frankly, in some organizations, not that I can do this because of conflict of interest, but I just feel like telling people, this is going to take a lot for these people to change, and if I were you, I would just go somewhere else. What if you're in middle management? Oh my gosh, these people have the worst situation of all. So you notice how they're a little bit thicker usually, no hair left. It's a hard job, and so I thought it's truly heroic, like in the Kanban and Agile communities, people are trying to do this from the middle out, and the fact that they're getting anywhere, I'm just amazed. I think it's heroic. And it goes to show that the power of good ideas and people working really hard and trying to educate people in all directions and so on. It's a tough spot to be in. Now, of course, if you are on the coaching consulting end, your life's even worse, right? So I'm trying to do that paleo diet now. All right, now, how do people actually lead, and what's actually going on when we talk about leadership in action? Well, there's as many approaches to leadership as there are people, right? Have you ever had two bosses that were exactly alike? Or if you're a consultant or a coach, have you worked with two clients who were exactly alike? Well, okay, well, maybe, since we tend to work with a lot of people. And you do see some patterns. But how can you even figure out what's the right approach? And people are very different in terms of personalities and their background and their mindset and all of this stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership styles. And if you start Googling leadership styles and you start reading books and papers on this, what you find is there's a lot of them. Command and control, anyone seen that? Yeah, they still exist. Actually, the military is not really doing that much command and control anymore. So they're trying to become more like special forces now. So they do a lot of education on leadership and so on. Now, charismatic leadership, we've seen, in fact, I'll give you a case study at the end with someone who definitely would fall into that charismatic style a little bit. That can be good, and it can be bad. So that's where you have very strong personality leading the charge. Steve Jobs is a good example of a charismatic leader who was very successful. Then there's the opposite. Never mind this charisma stuff. Let's just be quiet. Let's be in the background. Don't make a lot of waves, but just be there when you need to make those important decisions. But otherwise, just leave people alone. Give them an ability to decide for themselves most of the time. What about visionary leadership? Now we're back to we have the vision, we have the answer, and we're all going this way, and the reason we're getting up in the morning is this amazing vision, right? That sounds pretty attractive. Then there's the opposite of that again. Servant leadership. Well, actually the best line ever from a movie or TV show that exemplifies servant leadership is in and probably most of you are too young to remember this show, but it was a show on a British comedy called Yes, Prime Minister. Yeah? Okay. The great episode where he says, I am their leader. I must follow them. That's really servant leadership. And basically, you're trying to support people as best as you can in getting in the right direction. But you're not substituting your own ego or your own vision. You're basically trying to be an enabler as much as possible. What about participative leadership? So I mentioned Sweden before. And I'm not making fun of Sweden now. This is just not normative. This is factual. Sweden is known for having a very consensus-driven decision-making culture. Yeah? Japan is like that too. Right? And so in participative leadership, you're trying to get everyone involved in making decisions. And that, that way you build support, you hope, right? What about transformational leadership? Now that's the whole idea behind transformational leadership is that we're all going in this direction. It's a little bit similar to visionary leadership, but as part of that, we're changing. The organization is changing, we're changing too. And then there's lean leadership. And that's all about learning our way to the solution, right? So it's transformational, but we're focusing on learning. So what do we do when faced with all of these different options, right? Is there a right leadership style? Well, the approach that we've taken with the Lean Systems Framework, as we've been extending Lean more and more for knowledge work over the last decade, is we've kind of had the slogan. We said, if we don't understand something, let's make a model for it. Let's look at the different nuances and trade-offs and so on. And then let's see, if we can go for sort of fitness for purpose, as opposed to the answer is X, every time. So this our informal slogan is models plus methods equals results. So I've given you a little handout, and so what I'd like you to do is very quickly sort of put an X in the box for each of these attributes on the left, which I will explain briefly, to identify your own leadership style, or if you're not a manager, let's say you're a coach, maybe a client that you're helping who's a manager, or if you're an individual contributor, your boss. What is their leadership style like? Okay, so knowledge rights. Would you say that people have the right to decide whatever they want? Okay, well, that will be the very rightmost box. We put an X there. Or you can't assign anything ever. You're completely micromanaged. You can't even go to the bathroom without permission. Then you'll be in the left. So this would be, if you're a manager, your leadership style. If you're an individual contributor, your boss. I'll ask you about your organization later. Or if you are a coach or consultant, think of a manager in a client organization that you're working with. So the knowledge rights are your subordinates' experience. So how much decision rights do you give them? Those two add up to autonomy, by the way. But we're separating between knowledge rights and decision rights because they're two different aspects of autonomy. All right, I'm almost on time. So let's go through this. So evidence-driven means that you are guided by, when you lead, by the facts, just the facts, ma'am. So if it's only the facts, show me the data. If you can't support it by data with evidence, let's not go there. Integration, so how much do you emphasize connecting the dots as opposed to being happy to work in silos and not worrying so much about how everything else is related together? How much do you emphasize changing the organization? Well, I mean, you may not have a chance to do the stuff that you would like, so this has to be whatever you're constrained to do. If you want to change the organization, but you can't make that part of how you lead people. You just have to work within the box you're given. That happens a lot with team leads. How much do you stress individual growth? So for example, giving people tasks that will help them learn new things and so on. Or helping people themselves select tasks that will be challenging and interesting and developmental for them. How much do you use your personal charisma as a way of persuading people, either that this is the best vision or that this is the way we should do it, this is the way, or this is why you should do it? I skip one? Yeah, how much do you emphasize your own domain experience? So in other words, will you question Steve Jobs on usability? Maybe not so much. But there are some leaders who are basically sort of very domain neutral. They will tell you they can manage anything. Just give me goals, options, I'll make choices, do the best I can. And then there are some people who really rely on themselves having the answer because they're the expert. And you, who are their followers, should do what they say and sometimes they are. So again, I'm not being judgmental, And then how much you emphasize being adaptive. Sometimes the vision needs to be updated. Sometimes who's doing what or how we're implementing the vision needs to be updated. And there's some leaders who are like, well, I'll look at the vision again next summer. And until then, we're going to stay the course, right? That will be someone who's not very adaptive. And the final one is, how much do you use an appeal to vision and values to persuade people? That's called normative. So for the people who don't really talk about the vision anymore, at all, and they're just looking at, well, okay, if you get to this X value over here, that's good. Then they become much more utilitarian. Right. So if you fill this in, I'll give you another few seconds. You'll have some idea of what your leadership style looks like, or that of your boss. Knowledge rights and decision rights have to do with autonomy. How much do you give other people permission to decide? And how much do they have the right to know? So some organizations are very siloed, have very low decision rights, or very low knowledge rights, because they don't have much visibility into what's going on. They can't really ask what's going on. All right. Now, I'm going to run through really quickly these other leadership styles, and then you can see what they look like. And I won't be able to spend a lot of time on each of them, but just you can visually compare what you filled in with what's showing up on the screen as we go through this. So take a look at your own leadership style, and then compare with command and control. Or charismatic. Or quiet leadership. So if the leadership style doesn't really emphasize positive or negative, I've just put neutral. So quiet leadership says you shouldn't use your charisma at all. So I put, no use of charisma, right? So all the way to the left. Or visionary. So see if you can find patterns in your own leadership style of what you observe. Servant leadership. So you try to be adaptable and you give people a fair amount of autonomy. Participative. So there's some overlap between these. Then transformational emphasizes change and appeal to vision, the direction we're going. So visionary and transformational are pretty close. And lean leadership is sort of a combination of transformational, visionary, transformational and participative leadership. Stresses being evidence-driven, very much stresses development of the organization and of individuals. All right. Of course, you can visualize this in a different way as well. So you can sort of have your horizontal signature. Hey, this is what lean leadership looks like. This is a typical leadership style as we encounter in the field. And again, I'm trying not to be normative. I'm not trying to tell you lean leadership style is the only leadership style you should aim for. Sometimes it's not even appropriate. For example, let's say that you are shutting down an organization. You have 6 months to shut a company down. Do you care about continuous improvement and all that stuff? No. But you want to be nice and honest and transparent with people so they can get stuff done, but very different context. Right? Leadership at Starbucks, in a Starbucks store, probably doesn't look the same way as leadership in a startup software company, nor should it. So this is just kind of to make you self-aware that you have choices about your leadership style, and you can design, that's the title of the talk, you can design your leadership style, and then you can try and move your leadership style in the right direction. So think about your boss. And if you are a manager, how does your boss compare to your leadership style? Did you just kind of adopt what your boss did? Or if you're a coach working with someone who is a VP or middle manager, does that person's leadership style mirror his or her boss? So this tool can let you sort of reflect on these kinds of questions. And then someone asked about the organization. How does your leadership style, and that of your boss, say, compare to what's typical in the organization? Maybe you're all kind of the same way. Well, at least you can then have a conversation among each other about that. Another question that's worthwhile is to ask yourself, if you want your approach your leadership to be a certain way, are you going to be able to do that? For example, let's say you want to give people more knowledge rights and decision rights, right? But you are a middle manager, and you have constraints, and you are in an organization architecture with silos, and it's all imposed from above. Well, you can do some negotiating now. But there's probably some constraints that you face. And the same thing is true if you're a coach and you're working on the middle management level. You can help those people to some extent, but they have their own glass ceiling that they face as well. Now, let me put this in the context of leadership effectiveness. Because leadership style is not the only thing you need to look at for whether you are doing a good job as a leader. Now, the definition of leadership we've talked about so far, it talks about developing a vision, right? And it's an ongoing process. You have to update it more or less often, depending on how much adaptability you have as part of your leadership style and what's happening in the outside world that may force you to update the vision. And then you're trying to induce activity, and hopefully that will result in good business outcome and good results for customers and value for shareholders, right? Now, to the extent you're successful with this, you accumulate leadership capital, which is a function of your competence as perceived and your character. So you can think of your character sort of as a multiplier. So let's say your competence on level from 1 to 10, does this leader know what he or she is doing, but then multiply by character. So if we're totally trustworthy and everything, perfect character, it's a multiply by 1. Your character is sort of so-so that, that will decimate your leadership capital, and it cannot easily be recovered. Now, the more leadership capital you have, the easier it will be for you to persuade people, because they have faith in you, to continue pursuing the vision And the easier it will be to persuade them that this new direction we're going in now is worth looking at. Let's develop that vision together. Now, if you have a leadership style where you don't involve people very much in developing the vision, then you need a lot more leadership capital for them to go along in that new direction. So there are distinct trade-offs. If you have a leadership style where you're expected to have all the answers, so you rely on domain experience a lot, if you're wrong, you risk having poor outcomes, and because the expectation was that you were right about everything, then your leadership capital will erode. People won't believe you so much anymore. CEOs face that a lot with boards. They go and make all these promises to the board, as opposed to telling the board, well, we don't quite know yet, but we have to do these experiments, and you have board members who don't necessarily know how to tackle that, so you have to make up something, some slides, and then that's why CEOs get fired a lot, because of course they're wrong. We're all wrong, right? We can never be 100% right about this stuff. Now, the way to improve is, of course, doing Kaizen. So our version of the Kaizen cycle that we use for executive coaching basically looks like this. You observe what's happening, and then you reflect on your observations. So this is your personal Hansei, right? And then you look at what goals you're trying to achieve, and you're looking for a contrast between where we are and where we're trying to get to. And then you identify particular problems, and then you develop some solution scenarios, and then you take action. And so if you are a coach working with managers or executive, you can use this learning cycle together with the other models to help them develop self-awareness of where they are and what they're trying to change and how that's all going. If you're trying to coach yourself, this can also be helpful, but I really recommend getting feedback from people you work with so that you're not alone in the room trying to figure out what you look like from the outside, because we need mirrors for that, right? Now, let's look at signatures again. I'll give you a quick story, and then we'll have some time for questions. So this is sort of the archetype for lean leadership that's described in the literature and mapped into our model, right? Now, this is a CEO whom we'll call Jim. Jim was a really nice guy. He came in as a new CEO in a 130-person entertainment software company. And he had been executive in a very large entertainment company before. He was a pretty tall guy, probably about this tall, and had a very sort of loud personality. And he wasn't mean-spirited or anything, but just by virtue of his personality type and his physical size, he was perceived as being very dominating. He was perceived as being charismatic, basically. So the way his leadership style looked to others was something like this. Very high on charisma. The problem was that people were afraid of telling him when he was full of it. And he was very frustrated by that. He didn't want to overpower people. He wanted people to talk to him. So we did a little bit of coaching using this learning cycle, and we're able to modify his leadership style a little bit so that he kind of softened the edges a little bit. And that helped him a lot, because then people would tell him. And he was still fired, by the way, by the board, but not for that reason. There was a shareholder revolt, and so the other side won, and so they wanted their CEO. And we deal with that sort of stuff a lot. So that's part of the sort of the adult real world you have to deal with, that you don't necessarily control. So as I said at the beginning, even if you do a good job as a leader, for other reasons that do not have anything to do with your performance, you may still get the boot. Happens a lot. So here's what you can do. Try and develop more insight by getting feedback from people who work from you, from your colleagues, from your boss. Try and sort of have that conversation about, well, how are we doing as leaders, and what's our style like, anything we want to change, and so on. And if you have a good conversation about that, probably you'll be able to negotiate a destination for where you're going as a leader. What do you want to get better at, or what do you just want to change, because it'll just work better in the organization where you are. And this is something that consultants can do, by the way, with with their clients to help provide perspective. Far too many consultants are in the business of telling clients the answer is X. And the role of a trusted advisor is to help people get better, it's not to tell them the answer. And then, of course, do continuous improvement, right? And if you do, try and track your progress so that you maintain perspective over time. Changing your leadership style is not always easy. For a lot of people, it's very, very difficult. The CEO I mentioned, Jim, in quotes, it was very hard for him to hold back because he was a very smart guy and full of energy and positive energy. But people just were overpowered by him. And if you do this, hopefully you can get to that place where you can build a beautiful organization and make the world a better place. So that's it for now, and we'll take some questions. Thank you. Okay, so the question is, what did integration mean? And so we separate between being fact-oriented or evidence-based and connecting the dots. So both are necessary. So you have to get the facts, but you also have to understand how they relate to other facts. So what that means is, let's say you're working on something over in engineering, be curious about how that connects with the business model, with financial performance, I know people have been doing talks on sort of cost of delay and all of this stuff. And just try and connect as many dots as possible. And all our work with the Lean Systems Framework has been about making richer multidimensional models so people can connect the dots, beyond metrics and processes and so on. So lots of things you should be looking at. And the more dots you can connect, the more context you can, richer the context that you can establish as a leader, and then your persuasion becomes much more effective. Right? Because people can see the why, and they can see the alternatives, and they can see the thinking about why we're going in this direction and doing it this way. And they can help you come up with a context. So if you are participative in terms of your leadership style, you can involve them in connecting the dots, which is even better. More questions? Yes?
So how do you guys, in your work consulting, use this model to think about you as the coach or the consultant and your style as it interacts with the style of the managers that you're working with in the organization?
Oh, the consultant style? Well, what we try to do, and I should also mention that this is brand new stuff. So the data you show is sort of reconstructed from a case story and then fitted into this model. But generally the way we work is we don't try to, you guys know about invisible service, like if you go to a restaurant and stuff just shows up and you have the whole experience of having the meal and the waiter doesn't get in your way. And so we try to be like that a little bit, where like 98% of the time we're trying to just provide tools and perspectives, but we're not going to tell them you're wrong or never do this unless it's harmful for them to continue in that direction. So we don't really reflect so much on our style beyond that. I mean, there's a blog post I wrote, actually our most popular ever, on how leaders use consultants. And so we try to distinguish between sort of contractors on the one hand, which is what most consultants really are, and trusted advisors. And that's really the role that we try to fulfill. So we really demand a lot from the people we work with. I mean, they have to really want to learn and develop. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
Interested if there's a direct relationship in the normative stuff you talked about, and leadership and values and character. There is some good related, but not
Yeah. And I didn't really mention values a lot here. So when I talk about vision, it sort of consists of where you're going and what are acceptable principles for how you're getting there, right? So one is really vision in the strictest sense, and the one is what in our model, in the Lean Systems Framework, what we would refer to as organizational ideals. They're your values you pretend to be pursuing, and then we call those your ideals. And then there's the actual behaviors in your social architecture and your culture, and we have a survey instrument so we can unearth both of those and then show you the gap, and we then reconstruct a mindset in the organization that's causing people to have behaviors that don't live up to your ideals. And one thing that's cool about work like Mike's work is sort of in identifying what are the organizational ideals that go with these best practices or these methods. I was just looking at his slides from earlier today. And then what you can then do is if you map out an organization's social architecture, you could then see the gap in terms of, oh, these ideals we're actually doing a pretty good job pursuing already. But these other ideals, that's going to be a problem, and so we need to focus our coaching and leadership development, in those areas to help change those behaviors. Otherwise, these particular practices are not going to work that well. Yes.
When you talked about the types of leadership, having some Venn diagrams and for example, servant leadership and collaborative leadership, that could have some offline leadership.
Right. That sounds like a good wish list item. We never done that before because because a lot of this stuff isn't even officially part of the Lean Systems framework yet. It will be in the next iteration later this year. But I was thinking about that as I was dramatically finishing my slides earlier today, and that would be really helpful. And so finding creative ways of visualizing this stuff will just help people use it more. So we just have a couple. There's a table form, and then there's the signature. If you put more than one signature in the same, the horizontal signature next to each other and in different colors, you can also see how they contrast, and you saw that earlier. I like the Venn diagram idea, but you have to figure out which attributes do they have in common. So you have to do one Venn diagram for each one, and also keep in mind that the attributes are sort of on a sliding scale. They're sort of neutral, strongly positive, strongly negative, and so you'd have to chunk it, into subsegments to do a Venn diagram, because Venn diagrams are binary and based on set membership or not. So, yes, back here. There was someone. Sorry. I'm so sorry. It's a total blind spot.
So the way it's presented so far, I love it, but it seems like you're one or the other, or something that.
Your leadership style, you mean?
Yeah, but then
Actually,
Steve Jobs, he's
yeah.
Transformative, not visionary and charismatic.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the things I wanted to illustrate with this is that the archetypes that you read about, they don't match what people actually do in reality. So you can say that Steve Jobs had attributes of a transformative leadership, but in the way that we've illustrated different leadership styles, if the way the leadership style is described in the literature doesn't say anything plus or minus for some attributes, we just put neutral. So you can be both, a transformative leader and a charismatic leader and so on. Yeah. And so we try to just make a richer model instead of telling you your choices between these 9 leadership styles. We just said, well, look at these attributes, see what's working for you, what's not working. Try, if you're trying to build a learning organization, try and improve some things. And lean leadership style, as presented here, kind of shows you the gap between where most people are and where you would like to be in a learning organization. And you're all going to be in different places, and the model helps make that visible. So, final question. I think we're pretty much out of time. So, I think that's it. Thank you very much.